Welcome, welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I am so excited to have you all here. And we are also, just so you know, we are going live on, wait, you know what? I'm not going live in the right place. Let's see, we're going live on Facebook. That's not where I wanted to go live on. I apologize. We're going to go live though on Zoom, on YouTube, one of these places. So if you know anyone, see who would love to watch this, didn't get the link, we're going to go live on YouTube. All right. So welcome, everyone. So excited to have you all here. And many of you have been watching my YouTube videos for years, decades, in fact, they've been around. And yes, they're a little bit old. And so I have been meaning to find time to re-record everything with newer technology, better sound, and all that good stuff. And I'm decided that the release of my Mastering Competencies 4th edition is a great excuse to do this. So I am going to be doing a series probably over the next 2 years to do videos redo all the YouTube videos I have for both my family therapy as well as my counseling psychotherapy theory textbooks, so that hopefully in a couple of years, we'll all have some nicer videos with better video, better sound, and the whole 9 yards. So, and I've just decided the only way this is going to happen is if I actually invite people to a lecture and put it on my schedule and just make it happen. So I thank all of you for showing up today. And please feel free. We are doing, this is being a recorded live. God, what century am I from? It's being recorded live, and I will go through, I will do the entire workshop on collaborative therapy. And then at the end, we will have live Q&A for those of you who actually showed up live today. So that is the special bonus for rearranging your schedules to be here. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so today we are going to talk about collaborative therapy. It's a postmodern therapy and the related concept of reflecting teams. And so in terms of theories, this is definitely associated with postmodern therapy. And actually, I do have this in all of my textbooks. But I would say of all the theories in all of my textbooks, this is probably one of the most difficult to understand or grasp. And I think there are lots of good reasons for that. That said, I think in the 21st century, the concepts out of social constructionism, postmodernism, these concepts for how to form an ethical relationship have never been more important. And I do believe, as our fields continue to evolve, that this way of relating to others, in a nutshell, the word I would use, it's humanizing. It is a humanizing way of relating. We're living in a time in history where everyone gets polarized so easily. It's so easy for conversations to become polarized. And collaborative therapy in particular, the whole premise is about having dialogue, right? And this is this back and forth, each person in the conversation is really able to hear and take in and better understand the other person. And these are the type of conversations that I really believe our society is going to need a whole lot more of to heal so much of the polarization that we are experiencing on so many levels in our society, but also in our own families and in our own homes. And when we talk about working cross-culturally, working with diverse and marginalized clients, and I'm talking about marginalization can come in so many different forms. This way of working is I would say, the most ethical and the most effective in terms of learning how to have conversations with other people whose worldview is different than than your own. And I would actually add to that, we're always having cross-cultural conversations. The person you're speaking to is always influenced by societal discourses that are different than yours. And so being aware of that, no matter how similar they may seem or how different they may seem, the dynamic is always there to some extent. And so, and in terms of collaborative therapy and my history with it, this was really, this is a theory that has really been my, I don't know, my, I'm trying to think of, it's my foundation, I think is probably a good way to talk about it. But when I was going through graduate school, this was the theory that I found that really resonated the most with me. I was very fortunate to be living in Texas, and I got to train at the Houston Galveston Institute with Harlene Anderson. I got to work closely with Tom Anderson and many of the folks there who were like, you know, developing these ideas. And so this is really, for me, has been the most profound training I have had. And to this day, I still think it is the foundation of what I do with all of my clients. And there is something that humanizing, I'm going to say that word about 18,000 times today. It is a humanizing approach that really, you know, whether you're, you know, wanting to work in agency settings where often you just have so many different diverse views, or even in private practice, I have found that because of this way of collaborative relating, people can hear the difference for 5 minutes on the phone. You know, routinely, people talk to me for 5 minutes. I'm like, sorry, don't have any openings. Because I have a very small private practice. And they're like, oh my God, just talking to you for 5 minutes, I feel like you get me and understand me more than the therapist I just, you know, saw for 2 years ever understood me. And there really is a difference in how the clinician relates in this approach that is profound when you're on the receiving end. And I will say that a lot of what we're going to talk about is really, really subtle today. It is hard to get. You're not going to be a collaborative therapist by watching this. But I hope what you're going to get out of today is understanding what the heck this is and how learning to work in this way can profoundly transform how you do your work, and especially how you work with clients who might be different from you. I think that is really one of the true strengths. This approach is used around the world. In fact, recently I just edited a book with Harlene Anderson, and we had examples of how these collaborative concepts have been used around the world, not just in mental health contexts, but in business, in education, in consulting. And these ideas are profound and they are profoundly transformative. It doesn't matter where, what, you know, what organization or community you're working with. And we had folks who were running, you know, multi-billion-dollar companies. We had folks who were working in some of the most impoverished communities in the world. I mean, this is transformed. People working in climate change. I mean, it's an incredible book with Harlene Anderson. It's called Collaborative Dialogic Practice Conversations. No, it's called Relationships and Conversations that make a difference across contexts and cultures. And so I just share that with you to understand that this way of communicating and of relating, it really starts with the relationship and it informs how you communicate and have conversations, are transformative in just about any human context, whether we're talking one-on-one therapy, couple family, groups, educational, you know, classrooms, as well as educational organizations, business. There are many people who just use collaborative dialogic practices and conversations as a consultation model for any type of organization that wants to improve what it's doing, improving how it's functioning. So it really, compared to a lot of the other therapeutic approaches, collaborative has a pulse on something that is, these are conversations that really do make a difference for humans in just about any context. So hopefully I've gotten you excited, and let's go ahead and kind of jump into understanding this approach. And I will just warn you, if you like a step-by-step method of what question do I ask when, and you did a little manualized list of questions, you're not going to find that. And I know for some folks that's really challenging. Especially in the United States, we really like things to be very super practical and broke down and scripted. And so for a lot of folks, this it can be a little bit difficult to grasp. I'm going to do my very best to explain it as simply as I can. And hopefully by the end of this webinar, you will have a sense as to why it is this way. And it's because it's not scripted, because the questions a clinician asks come out of the living conversation that's moving back and forth in that moment. That is the humanizing piece. It is not scripted. It is being co-created in the moment between the two people who are there. And that's also why that humanizing quality about these conversations. So, okay, go ahead and get started. So if you're familiar with my textbooks, you know I have a section in all my textbooks called The Juice, and it's the significant contributions to the field. And what I do here in these sections is to really highlight for every single theory I review, and I review about 50 of them in all my different textbooks, what was the wisdom, right? What is the incredible insight into being human and the human condition, and to helping people struggling with life problems? What's the wisdom that this theory has? And so as you go through my textbooks, I highlight that so that you never miss it. And it's funny, I think most of the students and readers of the books love it. I've had some faculty say, hey, it's all important. They need to memorize it all for my test. I'm like, they may, but this is, a lot of people have told me it really is nice to have this highlighted. So we're going to start with the juice. So in collaborative therapy, this concept of what has been called not knowing and knowing with, I would say is the most important. It's also the most understood. So there are lots of people out there who have both verbally at professional conferences and in books, made fun of the concept of not knowing. People are paying you to know. How can you not know, right? So if you take it very literally and out of context and kind of not understand what the whole concept of not knowing is, yes, you can criticize it very easily. But this concept of not knowing is truly the key to putting your biases in check, to creating a more socially just approach to working with clients, to just being more effective. And so sometimes it's also explained as we're not assuming anything. It is not assuming therapy is probably another good way to think of it. And I think the best way to think about it might just be knowing with, and you want to get to a place where you and the client are creating or knowing and learning and understanding together. And that is the social constructionist foundation of this work. So clearly, collaborative therapists and counselors know a lot. They've all gone to graduate school, they study, they go to a lot of conferences, and they get trained and trained. There's a lot of knowing that goes into doing this work. In fact, it takes a lot of training and knowing to get to be more not knowing. It takes a lot of discipline, actually. So there's a lot of knowing that goes into this type of postmodern not knowing. So it doesn't mean that you don't know anything. Unfortunately, you do still have to take all your licensing exams and learn and read and train. But it's really about avoiding what you could call pre-knowing. So like when you have a client sitting across from you who says they have OCD or ADHD or whatever it might be, that, you don't assume, you already can fill in a lot of the details, okay, about what they are saying. And the truth is, the more experienced you are in this work, the more likely you are to have lots of pre-knowing that you put on your clients, and making a lot of assumptions. And the truth is often you're right. Okay. So you kind of get validated in doing that. And the good news is if you're new at this work, you are less prone to do that. That's great. So, forget imposter syndrome. There is a strength to not knowing and being new and assuming less and filling in those blanks less. That said, keep learning, keep going to trainings, keep studying for your licensing exams. So what this is, though, when we talk about not knowing, we're talking about disciplining yourself. And that is the word I would use. You're disciplining yourself to not fill in all of those blanks automatically, make assumptions, and instead really learn about what this client's lived experience has been. Okay. And it's not that you're going to forget all that. You're going to still keep your DSM up in here in your head and your ethical standards and what you've learned and what you learned from other clients and what you learn you don't forget all of that. But what you do is you just really hold it very tentatively. Okay. And you really do not assume anything. And you really begin by understanding the client's lived experience first. And you prioritize that and you start there. And so, from this perspective, at a very basic level, when clients have these similar sounding experiences and even qualify for the same diagnosis, right? You always pause to understand their experience of whatever it is they say happened and how they made sense of it. I remember this was years ago, probably at least 15, 20 years ago. I was seeing like a 5-year-old kid came in to see me, and her parents were going through a divorce, and they were bringing her in to talk about it with me. And this was certainly at a time where a lot fewer people were getting divorces. I don't know if there were fewer. There was less stigma than I would say today around the divorce. How about that? And my assumption was that this would be traumatic for the child, right? Thank God I had this training, because I still remember it so clearly. I just asked the question to it was my intake session with her. And I said, I hear that your parents are, living in 2 different houses. And what is that like for you? Notice the neutrality of that question. But in my mind, I'm totally expecting I'm like going to assess for trauma and all, despair, grief, everything the textbooks say should be happening, right? And the kid, the girl says, it's great. I absolutely love it. No one's fighting anymore. I get to have 2 houses. And as I asked a few more questions, I learned I get to be like all my friends. And she just happened to be in a kindergarten class where like 70% of the parents were already divorced. I checked this out with the parents. What's going on here with all our friends? And that was just random chance. And so for this girl, the meaning she made of her parents going through this divorce was that everyone's fighting less. I get 2 houses, twice as many toys, and I get to be like all of my friends. Now, I did see her for a while, and I know within 6 months, she had a different opinion, totally. But you can see how if I went with the standard interpretation, I could have started constructing this whole story of doom, gloom, woe is me, grief, trauma, without knowing it. Totally did not expect it. And I'm sure my eyes did something like, because I just remember, wow, I didn't see that one coming. So all the time, every word you choose does have bias. There's no way to ever get around that. And all we can do is get better at being very careful at the words that we're choosing, how we frame things, to create as much space for the client to share their experiences, their interpretations of life before we actually impose it on them. And so it's really important. So this is when we talk about not knowing and not assuming. And everyone's like, yeah, I don't make assumptions. Yeah, we all actually do, is the truth. And all you can do is become more and more aware of all of those assumptions. And there's no way to make a statement in conversation with clients where there's not assumptions to some level embedded in them, We just want to keep working. And it is a lifelong, I've been doing this work for over 30 years now. It is a lifelong process of learning how our biases creep in with what we say. Even if you spend 30 years working on this, you're still going to need to continue doing it. And so oftentimes what you're doing is asking a lot of obvious or seemingly trivial questions. And so, and that's where just asking a more open-ended, question with this client, like, it seems kind of weird to even think about, like, oh, someone could be going through divorce and not upset around it. Like, that seems real. Still, but from my worldview, that's hard to believe as a mental health professional. But for that kid in that moment, that was her reality, and it was her reality for many, many months. And I could have made her experience of divorce far worse by my assumptions, innocently trickling in, my evidence-informed assumptions, quite frankly. It was an evidence-informed assumption trickling into the conversation. So there's a lot of not assuming. And then also, so the first example we have here, one of the questions I ask a lot is, oftentimes people will come in and there can be a loss, there can be, something very difficult happened. And obviously, it's very common. Yeah, it's the obvious things that get us in trouble. You can, when someone's grieving their mother, right? You can imagine and be empathetic to all the potential feelings. But one of the things you do in this approach is you don't just, realize they're going through a difficult time and they might be sad or whatever the grieving emotions are, but you're looking for, what in particular in the loss, for this is the first example here, of the mother, where does your mind go to, when you're thinking about the loss of your mother? What in that is hitting you the most and touching you most deeply? And so even if you can be empathetic and they're having an emotional experience or relational experience or whatever experience that's logical, common, you want to understand how they are making sense of it at a very personal, unique level. Because, for example, one thing from this perspective is there is no one who experiences depression in the same way. And if you've been doing this work for very long, you can know they can have really different experiences around symptoms. But just, and even if there is depressed mood, people, what is it for them? How do they experience it? When do they experience it? It is all incredibly different. And so no one's depression, no one's anxiety, none of that. Everyone has a very unique experience of it. And so this not knowing with is really about not assuming and understanding from within the client's worldview. So let's take a look at the kind of overview of the process of treatment. And unlike some other therapies, the collaborative approach does not have specific stages. There aren't predefined goals. It isn't a stage type approach. And I will say, at the simplest level, there are just two things you're doing, which is actually one thing. You're avoiding monologue and you are keeping the dialogue going. It's two sides of one coin. And so the process and your primary job in this approach, no matter what comes up, no matter where the client's concerns are, your job is to keep a dialogue going, which more simply stated is avoid monologues and what they call the therapeutic impasse. So and so one way to think about this is to avoid a monologue versus dialogue. And so within the postmodern world, let's just say, I know there are other uses of these two terms. A monologue would be a situation where each party is trying to convince the other that they are right, okay? And so when you're having a dueling monologue with somebody where you're trying to convince them to see your perspective on something, and they are trying to convince you of your perspective. It's really a debate, for lack of a better term. And I really had mixed emotions about my son wanting to join the debate team for this exact reason. Um, those debate, that type of conversation, quote unquote, these dueling monologues, no one's really listening to the other person. They are just sitting there listening to what they're saying so that they can create a counter argument, right? And try to win this type of, it could be an argument or a debate type of thing. But you see it even, there are mental health providers, right, who will sometimes have a very strong opinion about what clients should or should not be doing, right? And so the clinician can get into this kind of monologue as this is what ADHD is and this is what you have to do about it. And the client can do the same thing with the clinician, right? And it's easy for that to happen. And so your sole job is to ensure that therapeutic conversations do not break down into dueling monologues. Now, does this mean you never share any scientific evidence? You don't have an opinion about what might be helpful? No, you as the professional, you do have some knowledge, and we will talk about, making your inner dialogue public. But before you force your opinion, even if it's your scientific professional and there's a mountain of research standing behind you, before you don't force that on your client. You have to keep this two-way exchange of ideas moving back and forth, them hearing you really hearing them, and you being willing to shift some of your perspectives as you listen to their experience. And that comes first. It's always first. And that's what you're watching in session to make sure that continually happens. So a therapeutic impasse is when therapeutic conversations become monologic, right? And so that means you're trying to convince the client of your opinion, or it means the client's trying to convince you because they don't feel like you're actually listening and taking in what they're seeing. And so, and there really can be times, and I've had times with clients where we have had some real differences of opinion. I can think of some of my high conflict divorce cases and some letters I had to write to courts, right? I had a difference of opinion with my client. It was in the letter. It doesn't mean you don't have a backbone or a stance, you don't cite research, but you still sit there and listen, and your client needs to feel heard, even if ultimately you end up with a type of disagreement, which is extremely rare, but it does happen. But the client needs to still feel heard and respected, and that this hasn't devolved into the two of us arguing over what's right or what's wrong. And so, from a collaborative perspective, this concept of resistance doesn't even really make sense, because there shouldn't be anything to resist. We're having a conversation, right? We're having a dialogue where I'm listening to them, they're listening to me. And yes, it is true. Typically, we spend a lot more time listening in the beginning, but if a person feels like you sincerely want to understand their lived experience, and you're listening without judgment and trying to understand, they will be much more interested in hearing what you have to say and listening to you in a similar way. And being able to even note and label points of disagreement. And there are times I have done that as well. And usually, time will tell who was, whose perspective was a little more accurate. And allowing that to be okay and safe and respected is part of this process. And so if ever it feels like the dialogic conversation has broken down, your main task is to get back the dialogue, which is normally going to require you to listen really well to what the client is saying. And so generally, that's your main task in the room, is to make sure these dialogues happen. It's much easier to control when it's just you and one other client. It can be much more difficult if there's, 2 or 3 clients in the room and you're having to navigate between a couple or family members who have very different perspectives on things. But your job, whether it's an individual, couple, family, or group, is to make sure this two-way exchange of information is happening. And usually the best way to know whether or not that dialogue is happening is that as one person is speaking, other people are really listening, taking it in, And you know, as the clinician, it's like, okay, I didn't realize that was that was going on, or that was their perspective, or, oh, I didn't see that coming. Because you're having to constantly shift how you're thinking about the situation. That's your sign you're at least doing your half of the dialogue right? And you want to see your clients experience that from you. And if there are other family members in the room, from family members as well. We'll talk about how to do that as we go through, but that's the main thing you were looking for, and what the process is. And basically, we're going to have these dialogues until the problem dissolves. So let's talk about that. So in terms of the therapeutic relationship, that really is the heart of the matter. And Harlene Anderson and Harry Galushan talk a lot about what they call the philosophical stance. And this philosophical stance is informed from a social constructionist epistemology, where it looks at knowledge as not something out there, right? That, you can, something just exists out there. This knowledge is independent and objective knowledge. Instead, the whole postmodern project, shall we say, and philosophy is realizing how everything we think we know, everything we take to be true, comes through language, which has bias and is negotiated in relationship, whether it's between two people or through dominant discourses and the individual making sense of all of society's stories of what is wealth, what is beauty, what's important, what's worth living for, what makes one person, valuable. So all of that is something that we navigate and make sense of, and all of the things that we take to be true and real in this world are socially constructed at one level or another. And so, and the crux of this whole approach is that how you relate to others, right, is the key to making this work. And that's why it's so hard to put this into a textbook. That's why you're not going to learn it from a lecture. It is a way of relating that is based on a lot of assumptions about what it means to be human. And so the heart of this model is how you interact with others. So let's talk some more about this. And so this philosophical stance really focuses on how, I'm just going to use individual psychotherapy as the example here, how your clients has a worldview that they have constructed through all of their life experiences, their family experiences, dominant discourses in society, their cultural narratives, subcultural narratives, their traumas, all of their life experiences. They have their experience of self and the world, and they have a template for how to create meaning, right? And that you as the clinician have the same thing going on in terms of all of our own biases, our own filters, our own life experiences, our family of origin, social location, perspectives. We have all of this going on, right? And the two of us come together and we're trying to make meaning across what are really two different systems, worldviews, two different systems for making meaning. And then we're going to try to create some meanings together. And the philosophical assumption here is you as the professional, your job is to try to understand their worldview first, okay? The way they understand it, not through your professional filters, which you will use at some points in the process. So you still need to go to grad school. So sorry about that, guys. But you will use that professional knowledge. But the philosophical assumption is you absolutely have to start with the client's worldview and understand that first. Knowing that your own biases and filters are going to impair your ability to do that 100%, but that you're going to do the best job you can, pretty much. So that is your goal. And the assumption is that's the type of relationship you need to have. And it's one of profound humility in the clinician, not that you have some magic superior superpower of, I've read all the graduate school textbooks, so I know better. I read research studies, so I can tell you what to do with your life. that's not the assumption here. The assumption is you have to take a humble stance and like, first I need to understand before, I need to understand. And that's my primary role here. And this is where the client is the expert. You hear then people make fun of this as well. The client is the expert in their life, right? And the clinician is the expert on the process. So that the expert of the process is don't let the dialogue break down into dueling monologues. The client, though, is the expert on their experience, their reality, and their worldview. It doesn't mean we negate everything we learned in grad school. There's still going to be a place for it, but it's not the prominent place. And so the philosophical stance is we respect the client's worldview. We honor their perspectives in a very profound way. And Harleen will often say, ultimately, I'm one human being having a conversation with another human being, and trying to share meanings across but we're just having a human experience together. And to see oneself as somehow, superior in significant ways, as superior to the other, makes no sense whatsoever. And so there really is this profound respect for the client's knowledge and reality that you don't see in a lot of other approaches. For example, I would say Tom Anderson, I remember, he once said, if a client is trying to hide something, like pulling back tears, and we can see that they're trying to hold those tears back, right? Most every other clinician on the planet is going to say something along the lines of, well, you need to ask, you need to lean in, you got to ask, what are those tears saying, or what is that nonverbal communication about? And that is something that I think most of us were trained to do at one point, by at least one of our supervisors or professors in our life. So, and Tom Anderson would say, no. If a client wants to hide something from us, they have that right. They have that right. We are not. And it was and he talked about it in terms of democracy. Yeah, and it doesn't mean we stop being helpful or we pretend like we didn't, whatever, but you respect that. You respect their privacy, even in this relationship where it's funny. I think I've met a lot of clinicians who really believe that clients don't have a right to certain forms of privacy and may not always respect that. And I found it so profound when Tom Anderson said, yes, they have a right to not share stuff with us, and that's really okay. So there is this, so the philosophical stance is a very ethical stance in how we relate to our clients with a profound level of respect that I would say is actually almost is rare in many ways in our field. Okay, so let's talk about being a conversational partner, or what Lynn Hoffman called witness. Witness. That is not a typo. So witness is this concept of the conversation is really a type of partnership where you are with the client trying to make sense of their lived experience beside them. I don't know how else to capture that. And I know this is what Lynn was trying to capture, but you are with the client and trying to make sense and understand their way of being in the world. And so in these conversations, your full humanity is also there. And that you're available, you're touched in the same way and moved through these experiences of trying to make meaning of whatever the client is struggling for. And I know I put this on a slide much later in the PowerPoint, but I'm just going to say it now. The metaphor that I have come around to in recent years, and I use in what I call my Therapy That Works unifying framework, is this concept of the holodeck is the metaphor I have come to. And so I'm going to just take a moment. I know it's in a slide somewhere else, but this is how I present sometimes. Sometimes you just got to jump ahead. So the holodeck is HOLODECK. It is, for those of you who are Star Trek fans, may enjoy tend to enjoy this metaphor. A holodeck on the Spaceship Enterprise in I don't know what generation Star Wars, Star Trek it was, but there was a room on this spaceship that was called the holodeck, and what it was a three-dimensional room. The user could go into a little control panel, and they could, program any type of world they want to. They could do a scene from their past, a courtroom, they could do a planet they're going to go visit, anything they wanted. They could create this 3D world. It's a lot like virtual reality, but you walk into it basically. But the user programs it. And the best description I've been able to come up with, that seems to make sense to my students, is that having a collaborative dialogue is like being blindfolded and walking in to your client's holodeck, and they're giving you a tour of their world as they understand it. And the thing about this holodeck is none of the rules and assumptions that you have in your world necessarily work in this world. So the for example, the metaphors I like to use is, lions can be herbivores and gazelles could be apex predators. And you really just don't know till you ask. Clouds can be routinely found on the ground and rivers can be routinely floating through the air. You just don't know till you ask. And that's when we talk about not assuming, it is that level of not assuming. So you are blindfolded. You're the one who is vulnerable in a different world that doesn't work in any way that you expect it to. You're blindfolded, and your client is giving you the guided tour of how things work. And the only tool you have is your questions to figure out, what's this over here? And how does it relate to over there? And what's that I just stumbled over? Is that, are those usually lions usually grazing all day like that? But be careful of the gazelles. They're the dangerous ones here. You just don't know. And you have to have that almost childlike wonder and not assuming as you are going through people's worlds, just like that little girl who was like, divorce, the best thing that ever happened to me. And that's also how you're doing this right. Your client's logic, the logic of their world, should routinely surprise you. I like to use this example because it's fun. I was doing a demonstration video, and I wanted a client I could work with where there weren't any legal issues and I had the rights and everything. So I volunteered my child because, well, I can sign off on his confidentiality rights as a mother. And so I'm doing this interview with my son. He was probably 11 at the time. And I thought I knew my son pretty well. And I actually use a lot of this collaborative stuff with my talking with my kids. But it was such a great reminder of how even with my kid, who I thought I was pretty collaborative with, who I ask a lot of not knowing questions to, and boy, did I get a lesson. Because we sat down and there was the incident he ended up talking about was how his teacher got mad at a student and the student cried in his classroom, 5th grade. And so, as we're doing this conversation, I asked my son, I said, so what was your what were you thinking and feeling when you watched your friend crying because the teacher, and he thought the teacher was way out of line. She was way too harsh, was his opinion. And I was totally expecting him to say something like, oh my God, it really, makes me not want to talk in class. And, I was scared, I was worried, and it made me fearful, basically, because I would have been fearful in that situation. My son just said, wow, it really made me think my teacher is an idiot. He said something along those lines. And I remember, again, kind of like that the other kid I was talking about, my jaw just dropped. I'm like, wow, I did not see that coming out of my own child, who I think I know pretty well. And that is how you're doing collaborative therapy. That whether it is the person who you think you know best on the planet, you should be routinely surprised. Okay, boy, all of us think we read our partner's minds and we know what they're going to do. And that is really when relationships go downhill and start having some issues. So this is how you relate to your kids, your partners, your family members, co-workers, and clients. It really becomes a way of being in terms of being with people, making meaning with people, rather than all of the multitude of ways that we do fill in with all of these tiny little, perfectly logical, often evidence informed, assumptions. And it doesn't mean that we never, I'm a huge fan of the evidence base. I'm a huge fan of all the theories out there. I'm a huge fan and recognizing that our own personal experiences all affect the process and are valuable contributions that we bring to this process as the professional. However, what has to happen first is that blindfolded tour of the holodeck where you understand the client's world from within their meaning-making system. And that is really what allows transformation to happen very rapidly. Okay, so let's talk about the art of not knowing and curiosity. So curiosity is really the spirit, the energy, the mindset that the clinician needs to have when working from a collaborative perspective. And so there is this total sincere curiosity. That is the blindfolded in someone else's holodeck is the best metaphor I can think of for how to explain how curious you need to be. Yes, we all have a certain level of curiosity with our clients, but I am talking profound curiosity. You take nothing for granted. For example, at the beginning of the pandemic, I had someone come seek me out. They had been at the OCD Institute of Los Angeles. I didn't realize we had one. And had OCD for years. I think they had a 9-10 year diagnosis of it. And even with that mountain of evidence, whole identity around OCD, I still went in with a curious mindset. I mean, ruthless curiosity is not the word, but radical is what I'm looking for. Radical curiosity. Okay, yeah, so you're 15 years old, you have a 10-year history of being diagnosed with OCD, even at the OCD Institute of LA, all your parents say, yes, OCD. I still sat down and I tried to understand her lived experience, get a tour of her holodeck while blindfolded. And it was very clear to me by the end of the tour of her holodeck around her experiences of OCD, quote unquote, and anxiety that she really had more anxiety than OCD. And what do I sit there and say, everyone else has been wrong. You don't have no, that's not what I said. I said, as I listen to you, what I'm noticing is this little piece over here sounds a lot like classic OCD over here, but she actually had 3 different forms of doing anxiety. So what I would say, but these 2 over here, these don't really fit into the classic definition of OCD. And it's really this one here that seems to be your biggest problem, even in the middle of the pandemic, right? And, and she was like, yeah. So we ended up just tracking these 3 different variations of anxiety, one of which did fit that OCD, but that wasn't her big problem. It was other stuff over here. And so this art of curiosity is, it takes, it's an ever evolving experience. Hopefully you are routinely surprised by your clients. And if you're routinely surprised by your clients, it's a good sign that you probably are being curious enough. And so it's a very radical form of curiosity that we're talking about here. And because it's really fueled from a social constructionist epistemology, which is epistemology is study of knowing, that that the assumption is that your experience and way of interpreting any given lived experience is totally unique to you, and that it's going to be different than mine, and I'm going to have to work really hard to try to understand things the way you understand things. And so whether we use the same words like depression, anxiety, OCD, oh, my favorite is, upset. That's another good word. Rude. Oh, that's another good word. I have no idea what I have no idea what my clients mean when they say rude, what they mean it by upset. I mean, that's just clearly that all needs a lot of radical curiosity to understand what exactly they mean. Sometimes their definitions of upset and rude, relate to mine. Sometimes they don't. And it's just realizing how much we are doing this. And it's not like you ever get it and you're perfectly, done with it, because every word has layers of meaning. So it's an ongoing process. And so really, this is that philosophical stance. It's this recognition, this assumption that everyone's constructing meaning in their own unique ways. And I have to be radically curious as to what my client is meaning in this moment. So we already touched a little bit on therapist and client expertise. And the client is really the expert on their process. And that, really we visit for what, 45, 50 minutes and in a week, every other week, once a month with somebody. And then we have a lot more limited information on their experience, their realities. And so, some of the way this plays out, if a client just looks at you and goes like, there's no way I'm going to do that, or that'll never work for me, you're not going to argue with the client over that. You're going to look for ways that make sense for how to engage or deal with whatever is going on. Then in terms of therapist expertise, it really is first and foremost on the process. And so we are responsible for having an effective and respectful dialogic conversation where both sides are able to speak, to be heard, and then to listen. And that there becomes, the dialogue is, as these ideas go back and forth, right? And once you have a true dialogue occurring, what happens is each person's worldview shifts to one degree or another. And sometimes, so if I'm sitting there listening to my client talk about their worldview and the world in general, they are going to say things that should require me to change my understanding, shift my understanding, sometimes dramatically, like the 5-year-old who says divorce is the best thing ever, or sometimes very subtly, oh, it was this OCD versus this type of anxiety. Okay. So I had to shift my understanding. I didn't think I was going to need to do change her diagnosis, but she shifted my understanding. There was anxiety there. We got the right theme going, but I had to shift it. So, and then when clients feel like they've really been heard and understood and that you get them, as you speak, right? What the dialogue part of it is, we're inviting clients to also listen to what we're saying. And no matter what distinction we draw, if it's a dialogue, not a dueling monologue, what happens is it's like seeds get planted and a distinction gets made. So like my client, where I'm like, it sounds like you actually have 3 types of anxiety going on, A, B, and C. So this is a new distinction for her because she only had the OCD label. And so, as she goes home with this new way of thinking about what's going on, I didn't tell her you don't have OCD. I just told her I see 3 types of anxiety, 3 different types of anxiety or areas of anxiety. She's going to go home and she may not. She may go home thinking, I really have OCD. It's the real problem. She may go home and think, I don't have OCD, or, oh my God, I have 3 types of things. I don't know what meaning, but whatever she did with that, right? She went home and she had it because it was a dialogue. She's going to take in what I have said, and it's going to, call it percolating. It's going to percolate. And so her internal dialogue is going to shift one way or another. Now, it doesn't mean that overnight her OCD-like symptoms are gone. But what it does mean is how she thinks about her anxiety and OCD symptoms is going to shift just a little bit, right? And we don't know what she's going to do with that shift. We can't control that. But it is going to shift typically. It's because we have this dialogue going on. I'm understanding and shifting kind of my understanding of what's going on for them, which is definitely fueled by all my theories, right? And our conversation, if it's a dialogue and not a dueling monologue, she's going to have some new ways of thinking about what's going to help her as well, or what's going on for her as well. And so this is kind of what's going on in this approach. And there really is this mutual give and take. And in this give and take, we really allow clients to take the lead in some extent on the content of what they think is going on for them, what they think might work or might not, what might not work for them. And that we are the experts in terms of the process of ensuring this dialogic process happens. Because when you have dialogue, change cannot not happen, because the client is taking in new thoughts, new ideas through this back and forth exchange, this mutual exchange. We're not controlling what they do with that. We can't even guess which of the many statements or interactions we had are going to be most meaningful for the client to create meaning with between sessions, but we respect that what is going on there. Another thing you will notice about these relationships, these collaborative relationships, is that there really is a very, there's a use of very everyday, ordinary language, and conversation feels like, not like an expert, you know, who's being, and a client who's receiving a treatment. It does not feel like that. It feels like there's this democratic back and forth. Everyday language is being used. We even will play with the meaning of words and such. And there's this very down-to-earth experience. And oftentimes clients, a lot of clients tell me, I don't know what you do different compared to other therapists, because it just feels like we're having a comfortable, normal conversation, but like everything changes after that conversation. Because I don't know what you do. I don't know if it's a magical power you have, but I've been in therapy. I had one client recently. I've been in therapy for years, decades. She had been in therapy for decades. And I've worked with so many different therapists, and you're the only therapist who doesn't talk like a therapist. And you're the only one where I have just radical changes after every conversation. And what was going on was that I'm in her holodeck. Okay. So when I'm in her holodeck, understanding the world the way she makes sense of it, and I'm asking, you know, do the lions always graze here? And are the rivers always like in the middle of the air and you got to dodge underneath them to like get around them? You know, you're asking questions from within their worldview, within their meaning-making system. Every question I ask, you know, we will get to a point, call it the pause. It's when you get that, I don't know. But you get to a point where, because you're asking from within their meaning-making system, they're like, oh, I never really noticed. Yes, the lions are here, and yeah, the rivers are always in the middle of the air, and we always have to duck underneath them. That's just how it works in this world, right? I didn't realize that, you know? And so what happens is, as you're asking these obvious, not knowing, non-assuming questions, clients are realizing, oh yeah, I learned that from my mom. Oh yeah, I learned that from my dad. And yeah, that's what all my friends do. And so that's for me why I feel like, you know, whatever. So they begin to see connections they never saw before, not because you're doing some amazing interpretation, insight. You've done all this hard work. It's just because you're like, is it always like this here? Are these two things related? Do they coincide often? You're looking for how things fit together and how they work. And most of us have not really explored our own holodeck very well, our own meaning-making systems. And we don't realize what we're doing. And so from this very non-judgmental, compassionate, radically curious place, we're like, does all of this normally go like that together? And yeah, some of those, yeah, they're like, oh yeah, it's always together. Oh, like, oh yeah, I never noticed that. And that's when you get that I don't know answer from my client, because they have to think about it. They never thought about it before. You know, it's like, no, rivers always flow through the middle of the air. That's always how it works, right? Clouds are always on the ground. What are you talking about? That clients cannot not see that distinction, right? Because it's this dialogue, this back and forth. And because you're in their holodeck noticing something, they cannot unsee it. Whereas if you're trying to bring in a foreign concept that comes from your theory, your experience, some research and evidence base, research shows this is the most likely thing to work for you. And the client can look at that and say, oh yeah, that sounds like it makes some sense. I'm good with that. Let me try that. So some clients will do that, right? Other clients can look at you and go, that'll never work for me. You don't understand how X, Y, and Z fit in my world, right? And so they can reject anything that's foreign. But when you're just in their world, trying to understand it from within their perspective, the act of trying to make sense of how their world works inevitably creates new distinctions that they never saw before. There's no judgment on them, and you're not telling them what to do with those distinctions, but it's going to shift their inner dialogue when the conversation is over and they cannot unsee it. Like my client, when I saw those 3 different types of anxiety, right? She now, it's going to be very hard for her to unsee that. I guess she theoretically could. But there's this new distinction that she was able to play with and make more sense of. And it allowed her to see what was going on in very different ways. And, eventually we came up with different strategies for each one of them. And it just changed her whole inner dialogue around the whole thing that allowed for new possibilities and new solutions to become available, because it's a new angle. It's a new way of looking things, and they cannot unsee it because it fits totally within their worldview. And so there is this very humble position, very natural, using everyday language, a very relaxed style, and a willingness to learn. And so there's a lot of just bringing who you are to the process. I use a lot of humor because I like humor. I have fun. But there is this sense of you're not in this kind of formal role, and I still have professional boundaries. I'm not going to put my license at risk, but there is this naturalness, and we will talk about being public with our clients, where we share what we're thinking in very honest ways, even if it's uncomfortable. Like the example I was giving, with a lot of court mandated clients, you may or may not send the letter they want to the court, and I'm going to sit down and discuss with you what I'm saying, what I'm not saying, and why. And I'm going to allow you to talk with me about that. And, in some cases I might change my mind. I don't know, but we will have very open, honest conversations. And that really is very helpful. And it's even just about simple things like insurance and diagnosis in the file, right? I just recently met with another client. And when I just explained how insurance and diagnosis works, they're like, you're the first therapist to ever tell me and admit that you're putting a diagnosis in my file if I use insurance. Yep. And if you don't use insurance, I don't. I don't have, that's how that game works. The insurance game is what I mean by that. So just even those practicalities and just being straightforward, honest about all, even the pragmatics of what we're doing, as well as the conversation. And so this concept of inner and outer talk comes from Tom Anderson, and it's SEN. Tom Anderson and Harley Anderson were very good friends, but not married, and their last names are spelled differently, just so you know. And so Tom says, if there are 2 people in conversation, there are 3 dialogues, or there are 3 dialogues going on that we need to be tracking as the professional in the room. Okay, you're always talking 3 dialogues if there are 2 people, and you add 1 more dialogue for each person. So there's the outer conversation that is going on, and the bulk of psychotherapy literature really focuses on that outer conversation. But what he points out, in every conversation, there are also 2 other dialogues going on, the inner dialogues within each person, right? So those are the 3 dialogues. And so we need to, of course, we are managing most actively the verbal dialogue that is going on in the room. But we're also attending to the inner dialogue. So for example, let's say you notice some connection in the holodeck that you're like, wow, that is really surprising. And you ask the client, is it always this way? And the client may pause. There's usually this pause that can happen. They're like, I don't know. I never thought about that before. is often what you might hear as you try to like understand the world from within their perspective. And oftentimes at that point is where they go into an inner dialogue, and you can just kind of watch them do it. And some clients really benefit from having a lot of that quiet time to go in their inner dialogue. There is a form of silence going on, but it is not that creepy standoffish silence that some therapists are trained to use to get their clients to speak. It's like you're pausing because you know that the client's going inward and they need that time to think, right? Similarly, there's an inner dialogue going on for the clinician. And the honest to God truth is we typically turn the volume down on that, especially when we're trying to at first understand what's going on for the client. But our inner dialogue, we don't want to, you're not shutting off that volume entirely, but normally it is turned down. And then there are points where you need to, turn it up and check in. And how does this line up with the DSM? How does this line up with my laws and ethics? How does this line up with my theories? How does this line up with what I know? And that's kind of us going into our inner dialogue. And sometimes what we're thinking may be very different than what the client is talking about or assuming. And there are times where it really is appropriate for us to bring in our inner dialogue. And there's, the ethical guiding principle is when and how do you bring in your inner dialogue? Does the therapist bring their inner dialogue to the conversation? Will it benefit the client? That's really the guiding principle there for how much of that gets shared. But at the very least, you need to be attuned to that and tracking that as well. And so allowing space for these various dialogues to happen, knowing that some clients really appreciate and need more time for that inner dialogue than others. In terms of the outer talk, it is always, the verbal conversation between folks. I think we're just repeating what I've already said, so I think I can go on to the next slide. Okay, so let's talk about case conceptualization, assessment, and what I call the viewing in collaborative therapy. So we have the problem organizing, problem dissolving system, and this is an older term used in collaborative, and I know Harleen doesn't use it very much anymore, but I still throw it in here because for some people, I think they still find it helpful. But the problem organizing system is whoever is talking about the problem. So if you have a child who has a teacher and parents and step-parents and grandparents and friends and aunts and uncles who are all talking about the problem, that is something that the clinician should be mindful and aware of, because whoever's talking about the problem is shaping people's understanding, definition, and however the problem is defined, that perspective, that angle, and that interpretation naturally informs certain potential solutions as well as, rules out other types of solutions. So that is why I think this can be useful, especially when you're working with complex systems, to realize there isn't just one definition. Harleen and Harry were originally training in more family systems approaches, where you're trying to look at a system, find out what the systemic definition of the problem was. And they began to realize that in a lot of families, each person has a radically different definition of even what the problem is. And that was useful. And what they don't do in collaborative, which might happen in a lot of other approaches, you actually allow all of those multiple definitions to coexist without trying to find the one exact perfect definition that everyone agrees to. You actually allow the different definitions to float in the air, in the room. And you allow those because if you can get people into dialogue, what is going to happen is that they're going to be able, their perspective is going to shift in one way or another. And even if their opinion, let's say, about this, what needs to be done, let's say you've got a family and how kids should be behaving and what kids are expecting, even if, let's say, you have a parent who thinks respect should look this way, right? And they're saying their kid's disrespectful. If you can get the family into a collaborative dialogue where people are actually listening to each other, truly taking in rather than having a dueling monologue, if you can get them into collaboration, what is going to happen is even if the parent still thinks, kid's not respectful, their internal dialogue about what is respect, what isn't respect, what should happen, what shouldn't happen, it has shifted in some way. And that slight shift, and maybe it will take multiple sessions to get that to shift enough, is going to, at some point, it's like it changes the angle, it changes the perspective, which changes the angle of how the problem is defined. It will one of these days, the perspective definition of what is the quote unquote problem shifts into an angle that a new possibility arises for what to do differently. And that is what is happening in this approach. So that's why they call it problem dissolving, because oftentimes what happens is that there isn't a quote unquote solution. Oftentimes it's like, the perspective shifts so that either sometimes it just disappears, like there isn't a problem. Sometimes the natural thing to do just becomes obvious. And so it's not like there are actually solutions needed every time. One of the strange things I do as a clinician, one of the strange things I've stumbled upon is I use a very postmodern deconstructed interpretation of the Myers-Briggs, the 8 different, cognitive functions, or how a mind can make meaning, right? Or relate to your environment. And I use this in a very deconstructed way and it has strangely, bizarrely become one of the most effective things I do with high conflict couples. Because for so many of them, it's like, oh, I thought my partner was doing this to just make me angry. You're telling me that half the planet works this way and this is a normal way to be human? I'm like, yep. Half the planet works the opposite of you do. Your partner does too. This is not passive aggressive resistance. This is not them not caring about this is just kind of their mind works differently. So in some cases, this whole area of long drawn out conflict is like, oh, okay. And so is it problem totally solved? But there's a lot of problem dissolving that can go on through something like that, where they just are able to see things a little bit differently and see their partner in a totally different way. And they had just assumed there was a lot of malintent and just realizing that, oh, that wasn't what it was. And so that is also what you're looking for, is not necessarily specific solutions, but realizing that sometimes problems really do dissolve. And so always knowing that's part of the process, rather than us having to find a solution. So this is where it kind of, the process is this, people come together talking about, organizes a particular type of system, and that as we have dialogue, that often these problems will actually dissolve. Okay. So let's keep moving forward here. We've talked some about social constructionism, but we talked about this philosophical stance. So right now we're talking about just case conceptualization. So you're really, in terms of what you're doing as a case conceptualization, is you're getting the tour of their holodeck. You are trying to put aside as many of your cultural and personal biases, theoretical, professional biases, all of those biases. You're trying to put those aside to as much as you can, which there's limits to that, and really understand the client's, I think of it as the client's meaning-making system. I'm trying to understand, as clients go through their daily life experiences, how are they making sense of what's going on? That's the primary thing I am focusing on, is how they are making meaning. How does all of this, the kid doing this, the parent or boss doing X, Y, and Z, how are they experiencing it all? And so that's what I am tracking as I listen to clients working from this perspective. And so every experience that we all have is informed by multiple layers of discourses. You can call these. There are, our personal or local dialogues, or, our relationships, our friendships. But there, we have lots of cultural and gender and multiple types of cultural discourses, subcultural discourses, right? You have the news, you have movies, you have love songs on the radio. All of these are actually filtering our interpretations of our day-to-day life. And, I think of so many romantic comedies and romantic love songs, actually, at least from my perspective as a mental health professional, portray certain behaviors as the most romantic signs of true love, where I'm like, oh my God, that is a red flag. You need to run. That is not a good sign of a healthy relationship. But we don't, we're all affected by these narratives, and they filter in without us even realizing how they are shaping our sense of normalcy and our own personal identities. So, so this is like what you're listening for and trying to track. So you're tracking these discourses, whether they're very broad level dominant discourses around, age, gender, race, sexual orientation, religion, social and economic class, all of those different things, or much more local from our own little friendship groups or social media feeds. That's one of the things we're finding with teens and young adults, how social media has so shaped many of their discourses and their worldviews in ways that really create a lot more anxiety and depression. And the research is very clearly kind of pinpointing those social media feeds are a significant source of the rise of anxiety and depression in youth today and young adults. And so what you're doing as you're assessing is just understanding and trying to track down where these meanings may have come from. So what you're doing here is you're just trying to make sense of the worldview, and you're not looking for errors, and you're not going to go in there and, like, even with the best of intentions. I was doing a simulation training with with my group of students yesterday, and the client was saying something, you just want to rush in and like save them and their self-esteem, or the client's self-esteem. Actually, this was with my therapy that works class. It was like, oh, we want to go in there and rescue her. She's it was a mother who's beating herself up after a divorce. Should I have done it or not? You just want to rush in with your superhero cape and say, you're an amazing mom. It's incredible how you're showing up for your kids, and you don't want to just rush in and counter those irrational thoughts, even if they're negative to the self, right? Which is a very cognitive, behavioral thing to do. And instead of rushing in to fix the errors, you just become curious about them, right? So it's like, where do you think, you can ask, actually, who do you think would look at you and say you're being a bad mom? Who are those voices? Where are those coming from? Is there anyone who might look at you and see it from another perspective? And so you're just curious. You're not going to rush in there and say, no, you're being an amazing mom, even as much as you want to. And even if you could just bring a stack full of, journal articles and research articles, to support this client. The client in the vignette was doing everything the research would say you need to do in a high conflict divorce situation. And we could have just brought in all this research, but instead we just got curious as to, where that thought comes from. And and she's like, the only person saying I'm a bad mom is the ex I'm divorcing right now. And, okay. And so the client was automatically able to just realize, oh, that is the voice of my ex that's still stuck in my head. So the therapist didn't have to rush in with a mountain of evidence, with CBT exercises. And because the client did it from within her own worldview, there's no way the client is going to experience that voice in the same way again. And we don't know exactly what she's going to do with it, but it's almost like the confrontation comes from within, and it's not a confrontation. It's just like, so, where do you think that voice of saying you're not a good enough mother, where is that coming from? And her answer was obvious and simple. It was my ex. It's what my ex told me the whole time. that we were together, and this is how he kept me kind of doing all the parenting, because good moms would do it all, right? So she had this whole big old narrative, and she saw it. The therapist, if the therapist came in and tried to counter it and saying, I think you're being a great mom, or the research thinks you're doing the right thing, none of that would have been nearly as powerful as the client herself realizing, oh, this is coming from the guilt trip I got for the last, 10 years about good mothers do all the parenting and all the nurturing and all of that while working, in this case, a full-time job. And it was his voice. And she's like, yeah, he's wrong. So it was such a much more powerful way to shift. I would consider it a wrong narrative, a bad narrative, an unhelpful narrative. But she did it from within her own worldview. And so it sticks. And that's what's so magical about this. This is why my clients can't even tell, like, what are you doing to create so much change in me that no other therapist has ever been able to do? And it's because I just stick in your worldview, and you're the one confronting yourself, and you're the one shifting things. You're the one who is doing the hard work. So in some ways, once you figure out how to work this way, it really is, I would consider, an easier way to work than you coming up with brilliant ideas and reframes. So, and what you're doing, really, the best way for me to describe this too, I like metaphors. It really is very much like a meditation, except for instead of focusing on your breath, you're focusing on the meaning making. It's like a breadcrumb trail of meaning. And so, they say this and that happened, and then they saw it this way, it made them feel that way. And I'm tracking the logic there. And it takes all of my attention, just like you would if you're doing mindfulness meditation. It's tracking all of that so closely. And so it makes sense to me. And I ask enough questions till it really does make sense to me. And so recently I was working with a client who I've worked with for many years. I know him very well. And he was sharing around the launch of his child, how he, was really hitting him very hard. And I felt like I knew this client pretty well, kind of like my own son, right? But I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't track the meaning. And so I had to really slow down and ask and become radically curious till we could identify how the launching of kids created this emotional reaction or perspective, or his particular experience of loss. And so there is just staying with it till you really make sense of it. And so you're always continually assessing every single session you make. When they come back, you just know that they just had 1,000 different moments where they constructed new meanings. You're clueless as to what meaning they could have constructed since the last time you met with them. And so you start again, afresh and anew, every single time in that holodeck. So let's talk about change. And I love the definition of change in this approach. There isn't a predefined definition of health, which makes it really useful worldwide. It is used worldwide because of this. There isn't a particular way you're supposed to look when you're done, so you can really use it broadly with diverse clients. But what you're looking for is an overall sense of agency. So rather than being a victim in their life narrative, do they see where they have agency? Do they see where they can make a difference? Do they have a sense that they have influence over their direction of their life? And so that's what you're looking for. And obviously, we all have constraints, and some of them are typical in a given culture, and some of them are very unfair and oppressive in another culture or a subgroup within a culture. But even within that, are they able to emotionally and mentally have a sense of agency? If you think of Viktor Frankl, there he was in a concentration camp, and that is where he realized, I still have agency within my own mind, and so hopefully there are fewer and fewer people in situations like Viktor Frankl. And clearly we have a lot of work to do in this world to make sure everyone really lives in a fair, just society. And that said, it's looking at Where does the client have agency? How can they use it? How can they embrace it? Because it's that sense of agency. We want to help our clients maximize and cultivate that anywhere and everywhere they can in their world, and to look at, where their choices are. And sometimes we feel like we don't have a choice. I would say very many times in life, we have a lot of bad choices we don't like in front of us. And many of us experience this at multiple points in our lives. And, clearly there are some who experience this more often than others. But it's navigating all of those difficult choices is what your job is in this therapy, and helping people to see where they do have agency, and where they need to act, where they can to, and sometimes what the choice is to advocate for justice. That is a choice that can sometimes be made. And then there's sometimes, where that's one of the options, and that may not be the choice that your client takes at this point in history. But to look at all of those various choices. And so, and also from this approach, it's not about empowering our clients. The perspective is, to a certain extent, we all have certain types of choices. And oftentimes we don't like the choices that are in front of us, but you have those choices, like you may not like the government or what's happening in the country that you're living in. And you may be faced with the choice of, wow, I have to leave my friends, family, and the world I know, if I want to get out from whatever system this is, versus, it's a choice. It's a choice to stay in this, one situation versus another. And what happens from this perspective, it's like, if the client can consciously make that choice, whether to stay or not to stay, and to consciously make the choice, whether it's staying in a country, staying in a relationship, making a choice of what type of job to stay in or not stay in. And there may be extremely, unfair reasons why you're being forced to this very difficult decision. And yes, there can be a lot of layers of, either societal or very personal levels of injustice that are there, but it's how do we increase the client's seeing where there is still a choice, and often it's not a fair choice, but increasing the agency in those moments are going to generally help people to, in terms of their mental health, I guess that's the best way to say it, is to create their sense of agency, which really enhances a sense of wellness. Like, there are periods of my life where I've simply chosen to work more than I certainly think is fair, right, and just. But part of it is because I've chosen to live in California, and I can sit here and whine about the cost of living here, or I could pick up and move someplace else. And there's a piece that happens when you're like, yeah, I am choosing this set of problems. Okay. I like sunshine. I like warm weather. I like to be near my family. I'm choosing to live here, which has necessitated me working far more than I wish I had to. And when you own that, rather than sitting and complaining to whine about it for decades, which some people do choose to do, you're increasing a person's sense of well-being, I think, is the best way to do that. Okay. And ultimately, the change process is conceptualized as a transformation, right? It's not necessarily change per se. You're not going from state A to state B, but typically you're going to keep some sense of who you are and some of the original aspects, and add others and possibly shift away from others. But there's this transformation that happens that is not literally just change or a new solution. It's a very complex, multi-layered experience. And it's not controlled by the therapist, but it really emerges from within the client. And that this is really a mutual process that gets facilitated, but ultimately the client is the one who decides what to do with the conversation that's going on in the room. They take it in, they mix it around in their inner world, their meaning-making system, their holodeck, and they're the ones who decide what the transformation, what the changes are going to look like. And we are just there to facilitate the conversation that allows them to do the transformational process, but ultimately they have agency and autonomy in what that looks like. And that is why when working with diverse clients, this can be so important. I was also staffing a case with some supervisees recently where it was a family, very collectivist culture and very collectivist family worldviews, you know, child to these parents with very collectivist values. You know, some of the assumption was we need to have this client obviously needs to more independence and to be, you know, less enmeshed and, you know, for more differentiation. And I had to pause everyone and say, yes, for most of us, looking at what's going on here may seem like that is what the, you know, Americanized child needs. But you know what? That's not our job to define that. Our job is just to have conversations that allows the client to make sense of, in this case, what are the cultural values that their parents espouse that they want to continue? What are they, was an adult child? And what do they, as an adult, you know, want to keep from their traditional culture? What else is there? Is there anything from this American culture you want to mix in there? And what are the values you want to choose? How do you want to combine this? What are your choices? How are you choosing to enact these different cultural narratives that we're at odds with each other in multiple places? So that's all what the client is going to do. We just have the conversation that helps them have productive ways of thinking about these issues where they feel stuck. So let's talk about the doing. You're probably wondering what the doing looks like. So the one way that you'll see, there are lots of different metaphors and ways of explaining this because it is such a subtle process. It is a very difficult one. And it's not one you're going to learn from a textbook, is all I can promise you. It is one where it takes a lot of practice experiencing it, being on the receiving end of it. I recently did a demonstration session with a therapist who was trying to learn to work this way. And it was the person at the end said, oh my God, it really helped to experience this because I realize it's so hard to describe this or know what it's really like till you're on the receiving end of it. And, you know, a lot of the description was, you're just asking me questions, you're super curious, but as you're asking me these questions that are not loaded, there's no bias, it's just like, is it always like this? You know, I was able to realize and remember things and pull some things together in ways that I'd never had done before. And I left the conversation knowing exactly what to do with this issue. But it was just so weird because unless I was on the receiving end of it, I would have never truly kind of got what this process is. So there, but that's this understanding from within the dialogue, and the questions that you're asking is just following the breadcrumb trail of meaning. So, you know, let's just say we had the example of the mother, you know, passing away, right? So your mom passed away, and you know how you listen to what they're saying and follow that, and then asking about, you know, how they made sense of it. What's the part that really lingers with them? What's the part that, where does their mind go to the most around all of this? You know, what in your siblings' response what about that response upsets you? There's a lot that I often will say, there's a lot there that can be upsetting. What upsets you the most in that? And so I really get to understand in a much more intimate way how they're making meaning. And so the questions really there's no script. There's no script. You have to listen and ask and make sure you understand that, can follow that breadcrumb trail of meaning. You're often using the client's words and expressions rather than your own. And really, the client comes to understand their experience better as you try to understand how they're experiencing the situation, how they're making meaning within their logic system. Not just saying, yeah, that makes sense, or having empathy is like, yeah, is you knowing how they're feeling. This is something totally different. You're trying to understand their perspective and how they put all the pieces together. And what happens is at a certain point in a good collaborative conversation, this process of mutual puzzling happens. And it's often when the client says, you ask them a question and they say, I don't know, I never thought about it, or something along those lines. And what happens is then you don't rush in to save them, and you don't rush in with another question. You get curious, and you want to invite them to be curious, like the two of you, right? Side by side, getting really curious about this holodeck. I wonder, I've never thought of that. You'll hear my clients say that often. I don't know. Let me think about that. And so if they don't know, it's often where you've stumbled on a new meaning. You're making new meaning right there in the moment. And you want to say, so where do you think that could have come from? Your interpretation of, I guess that mother thinking she was a bad mother, right? Where do you think that could have come from? Because I think her first response was, I don't know. Then where do you think you could have heard that before? Where do you think that could have come from? And so sure enough, she went into her Rolodex of memory and is like, yeah, that's the voice of my ex. That's the only person who's ever told me that. Okay. So it sounds like, so that's where this mutual puzzling comes in. And you want the conversation to move to a place where both of you are trying to understand why this holodeck is organized this way. What's the rhyme and reason? What's the programming of this holodeck? What is a system of interpretation that they're using when they encounter the stressors in their life? And so you're really slowing things down, allowing those pauses to be there. And there is this curiosity, and it's almost like, I always feel like I'm a bit of an archaeologist. There's this like excitement in the air as we're trying to make sense of things. And like when my client who was working around the launching, and I didn't get the first description of the meaning, and there was a point where I think it made sense in his head, didn't make sense to me. And I had to ask, okay. And then finally it's like, it's like the curiosity catches. It's like it's contagious in a good way. But you will see that there'll be this visible shift often in clients, and they soften and they think, wow, where did that come from? Like the client who had to wonder, where did that judgment of her parenting come from? And so this is why that two-way exchange of information is so important. And it takes a lot of vulnerability for clients to put down their armor, roll up their sleeves and go, where did that come from? Why do I do that? Where did that emotion come from? And that takes a lot of trust and vulnerability. So, and it is that sometimes you're just really kicking around ideas to see, what happens. And sometimes I'll just, sometimes if we really get stuck, I'll lay out some multiple choice options and we'll play with each one of those to see if one of those kind of fits. But there is this mutual curiosity that becomes contagious, that is shifting the client's perspective on the situation from within their worldview, which is why it sticks. And it's so natural to their thinking system that's like my clients like, what do you do in here? Because I don't know, it seems like we're just having, pretty simple conversations, but I go home and I see my whole life differently. What's going on? Anything. All I'm doing is asking not knowing questions, but you're getting curious about your own life. You're putting the pieces together in a new way. And when you go home, you cannot see your life from the same perspective. One of my favorite all-time comments is the appropriately unusual comments from Tom Anderson. And what these are is Tom made a distinction about what we say in therapy. It can either be too usual or too unusual. And either way is not the right distance for clients to create meaning, which is what he said. Appropriately unusual comments and questions are what generate the new meaning for clients. Because if you're too usual, you're too close to the worldview that the client is in, they're not going to see anything different. And that is why when we're in their holodeck, we're trying to understand the meaning-making system, but we are asking questions that are different in that way. If you're too unusual, you're coming in from using your theory too heavily, using our theoretical professional assumptions. If you're too unusual from where the client is, that's too far for them to create new meaning. And there is this sweet spot where you're appropriately unusual where the client has to pause and say, huh, yeah, never thought of it. But the comment or the question fits naturally into the client's worldview. And so it's organic, it's natural, it fits. I can't describe it in any other way, because if it's too foreign, they can just reject it. And so how far do you get? Totally depends on the client. You know, the best example I have is adolescence. In the beginning, you cannot be too unusual, because you're going to be one of those judgmental adults that they don't want to talk to. So when you're talking with teens in the beginning, you want to be very close to their worldview and how they see school and music and screen time or whatever it might be. And you're trying to understand how all that works for them. And once they realize you're not one of those judgmental parents who's going to tell them how to live their life, that you're actually listening and trying to understand, it's amazing. Boom, you have a whole football field worth of space to play to be unusual. And they'll usually be able to hear a lot of more unusual comments that you might have to share. So every client's different. It can ebb, it can flow on different topics, but you can just tell by whether they're rejecting what you're saying or whether they're able to generate new meaning. And so it's these appropriately unusual comments that it's like a ripple effect. It's not like, oh my God, therapist, that's the most brilliant insight I've ever heard, right? If your clients are saying that, then what you've done is not going to necessarily stick, and they can go home in 3 days from that going, oh, that's not going to work for me. But these appropriately unusual comments are more like a pebble thrown into a still lake where there are these ripples. And it creates this percolation effect where they can't see the situation in quite the same way. And that is what an appropriately unusual comment does. And it's a series of those that typically will allow the client to stumble upon a new way of seeing something that was right there all along. They just didn't see it, right? That is typically what it feels like. So how far to go? Each client typically has a different level. I think I just said all of this, so I'll just kind of move through this. So there's just a real difference in terms of how far you can go with all of that in terms of those differences. Okay. So the concept of being public is about sharing your own inner dialogue. So we talked about this earlier, and I promise you we'd come back to it. There are lots of reasons that therapists may share their inner dialogue, but there are a couple couple main reasons here. Is, you know, if something's going on in treatment, to talk about what might be going on and what they think may or may not be helpful. And so, I mean, an example of this may be a client is discussing a set of symptoms, let's say, and you might think a particular treatment or medication or referral might be appropriate. And so, yes, there's a point where your inner dialogue is saying, yep, this checks all those boxes that the professional knowledge says might be good to do X, Y, or Z. And so that is where you come into the conversation and you say something like, you know, do you mind if I share for a little bit some of my thoughts on what's going on with you, or some of the research, or some of whatever. And, you know, even when it's research, you're like, the research describes typically what works for the majority of people, but it doesn't always work for everyone. So we need to also just keep that in the mix. So you give them even permission to disagree, but to have those conversations. And so you're introducing professional knowledge by being public about it. I'm not going to sit there and, you know, hide what I know about X, Y, or Z and its treatment, what the research says, because I'm being totally collaborative. If someone's describing something and like, this is, you know, I know from my professional set of knowledge, these are the things that may be likely to help, I'm going to say it, but I am not going to demand it and not insist on it. And so the other thing here is to using those private thoughts to keep the dialogue going and to be very honest about what may or may not be happening in session, what you're seeing, what you're thinking. Certainly, like with court documents and those sorts of things, you know, collaborative therapists will typically have the client read the letter before it gets sent, whether or not the client likes what's in the letter. Ideally, you write it with your client together would be ideal, and being honest about whatever your inner dialogue is about the situation. And those can be very difficult conversations. So, but this idea of the being public with your inner dialogue this is how you introduce the professional knowledge base of the field, because you still have all this knowledge that they don't, that you introduce to the conversation, not as the be all end all expert. This is what the research says is what you got to do. That's not how you deliver it, but you introduce it as something to be considered with everything else that is going on. Okay. And reflecting teams are very much part of the collaborative process. And this is evolved out of systemic family therapy, where there used to be a family with a therapist in the room with a mirror and a one-way mirror and the team behind watching. And the therapist used to go out behind the mirror and then talk to the team who'd give them an intervention and whatever. And then the therapist would come back and talk, let's say, to the family. What Tom Anderson did, who's the one who pioneered all of this, is he said, what if we just let the family hear what the team has to say? And so the concept here is that the team is going to have multiple voices. Again, you don't want the team to come and all agree on the same thing. You actually want to have multiple different perspectives to be voiced. And that allows the clients to make new meanings. And so what happens in this process is that as the clients are listening, they're told that, the team is just going to share some of their perspectives. Some of it may resonate, some of it may not. But what you're doing is just giving the client some new points, new ways of looking at what's going on in their life. It helps them see things. And different clients get totally different things out of this process. I'll be honest, I've done many, many reflecting teams, and often what helps the most is, oh my God, they all think I'm doing a good job as a parent, or they don't think I'm a total loser. That's often like the big insight they get, that 3 or 4 other clinicians, see the good in me. And then sometimes there's a phrasing or a word or a reframe or a metaphor that's like, that becomes what percolates. But you just get a whole bunch of more points of percolation, a whole bunch of other new distinctions that can create new ripples of meaning in the weeks ahead, or after the client is done. But most clients find these extremely, extremely helpful. I know there was one study said it was like 3 or 4 sessions to just have this one. Obviously, you're not judging, you're just speaking from your position of what you noticed from the conversation that went on. And you're just noticing different things, and sometimes you'll share some of your own personal process. But it is a generative process, and it's a lot of fun if you get a chance to use one. So the guidelines that Tom Anderson offers is you obviously only do it with client permission. You give the clients permission to listen or not listen. You only comment on what is seen, on what is seen or heard, but not just what's observed. If a client, especially if a client's not trying to, hide something, but you're also, it's always very tentative. You're asking questions. You're speculative. I'm wondering if XYZ were to happen, what would be so and so's response? I'm wondering, so that's kind of a hypothetical one. I'm wondering if this is a pattern that happens. I wonder if there are any exceptions to that. You can just wonder, you're wondering out loud typically rather than making statements. Comment on all that you hear, but not all that you see. The team, the space for the team and the family, there should be usually a fair amount of space so that family feels like they can have some distance. Listening for what's appropriately unusual. It's Tom Anderson. And asking them how they want to use the session today. So these are some guidelines for actually using a reflecting team. Okay. So, and I think I already did this for you, but this is a picture of the holodeck. So I like to use the holodeck metaphor. It seems to be the best way I can explain how to do this very kind of, oh my God, there's no script. What do I say? But it is, if you can get in the mindset of you're entering someone else's world, you're going to get the movie and you're going to get the interpretation. So what happened in the fight with your partner? How did you make sense of it? Give me it step by step what happened. So this happened and you made sense of it this way. Then that happened and you made sense of it this way. And you're tracking this breadcrumb trail of meaning. And that is where your focus is. And all of your questions come from, not all, the majority of your questions come from asking how to put those things together. Okay, so I hope that was a fun introduction to collaborative. And so I know all my textbooks have at least one chapter on postmodern, and so hopefully this is helpful. And if you do have access, there is a video series that shows a demonstration of both collaborative and reflecting teams that will help demonstrate this whole process for you. So thank you so much, and hope you enjoyed this, and I hope it help you make sense of what is a very complicated and difficult theory to understand for a lot of people. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and take some of the questions here, and so you can go ahead and put questions into there's a Q&A, and if you can put your questions there, that would be awesome. And then at the end, I will skim through the chat in case people put questions there, but this allows me to kind of focus on it. So, okay. So, hi, Sylvia. I saw that invitation. Yes, good to see you. So, the slides, I don't know, it's impossible to offer slides to, maybe I can do it for the folks who attended live. They will all be in my Laugh Your Way to Licensure course for those of you who are in that class. You don't need to look for them. What I could do, and anyone who's a professor listening to this who uses my textbooks, you can, as a professor, get access to the slides. Students cannot, and especially this set of slides. So what we could do is we'll try to send it out. You registered. I have to think about if I have your emails. If I have your emails, I can probably email them to you. I'll have to work on that. Okay. So in terms of the bibliography, it's in all my textbooks. If you go, the philosophical stance, it's just Harlene Anderson. There's Anderson and I have 2 books, and Anderson 1997 has a book. But I would say anything by Harlene Anderson, including our most recent book, is where you would find that philosophical stance most frequently cited. Okay. Yes, okay. So Letitia asks a great question. And yes, I would say that, sorry, you aren't reading this, are you? So Letitia is asking, when you have mandated clients working with Child Protective Services or Ministry of Child Protection, how do you use this model? I will tell you, the Houston Galveston Institute, where Harlene and her team developed these ideas, they had huge contracts with Child Protective Services. And this is an ideal approach to work with mandated clients. And because what you're doing is you're being very public with it all. Okay, the court has sent you to therapy. Hi, I'm going to be your therapist. Let's look at, why do you think you're here? Let's look at what, hopefully you get a court document, and what does your social worker say why you are here? How do these two things align or not align? And, oftentimes, because I actually did a lot of this work for a while in my career, I said, okay, so the social worker says you can have your kids back if X, Y, and Z are happening. Do you want to do that? Are you willing to do that? And if the client said yes, then yep, let's figure out how to make that happen. We're just going to figure out how to make it happen. And so we were able to align together on the goal of getting kids back, doing what we need to do. And I don't even get caught in the fray between the two of them. And I would tell them, I will write I'm going to be your advocate all the way. I'm going to help achieve all these goals that need to be achieved, but I'm not going to lie for you. And so, we have to work together, and I will let you know exactly what I think is going on and what we need to be doing. And, the relationship was respectful. It was honest, it was transparent, there was no monkey business. They could see the letter, what I thought they needed, and when it came time to write a report to the court, This is what I think you're doing well. This is what I still think needs to happen. And we're going to have this conversation honestly and face to face. And so it really created trust in a system where people typically do not experience a lot of trust. And where I really felt that there was injustice being done, I would advocate on their behalf. On behalf of the courts or with the social worker, I would challenge them where I felt like they needed to be challenged. And so really it's just an honest, conversation. And certainly there were times, I'm in the United States. And so certainly there were times where, there was a cultural piece because there's certain, cultures in which physical discipline is more legally allowed than in the United States. And again, there's a choice to be made here. You're coming from a culture where corporal punishment is, you think, that is something that is accepted and normal, right? Or the way you were raised. And so, but you're living in a country that doesn't see it that way. It's certainly certain variations, and every social worker is different, right? So how do you navigate that, right? And to talk about that, this is a choice point you have, right? Are you going to work with, there's certain laws, right, that would not allow for certain treatment of children in the United States. And if you're going to choose to stay here, you have an option of having child protective services called on you on a regular basis, or you're going to find a different way to parent. So, and those are two obvious ones that come to the top of my head. Obviously, there are lots of variations in between, but we would have those conversations very openly and frankly. And it really, that's where the agency comes back. And is it all, and so is this fair? Is it right? Is it just, sometimes we're not changing laws around child protective services. And with me, that's beyond my scope. But we can have conversations about understanding what your choices are even within that. Letitia also asked about using this with complex trauma. Absolutely. It is a great model for trauma work, I have found, because it is safe. It creates this incredible sense of safety, incredible sense of agency and autonomy, which is typically lost with most forms of abuse. And so it really helps the client truly re-experience that and how we talk about that. For example, I actually once had a foster child come see me, and she was 7, 8, 9 when she came to see me. And she was actually, not only had she experienced abuse, she was sexually perpetrating on others. And I suspected, using all my professional knowledge, that she had probably been a victim of child abuse, some form of sexual abuse. And I asked her, of course, I went to go assess that the way you need to. You still have to follow all the laws when you work from this perspective. And boy, she was so young, 8, 9, something like that. She just looked at me. She goes, I know what you're asking, and I know what you have to do. If I tell you what happens, I'm never going to tell you what happened. And she didn't, not for 3 years. And so, she, I would say, I certainly experienced complex trauma. And we were able to work with it even without even knowing exactly what happened to her. I never got the full story. But within 3 years, all of her behavior had stopped. A lot of her age-inappropriate behavior had stopped. She had became successful. Actually ended up reunited with one of her parents. Her school was fine. Her behavior, which she had, we'd call it acting out behavior or whatever, had totally gone away. And, she may still need to go back and work through some of that as she gets older. But we were able to get her on a normal course of development, let's just say. That was remarkable to me. So, but most of my clients are trauma survivors, and I find that this way of working, and even what I'm realizing going in and doing that holodeck tour, it has this almost meditative quality to it. It does a lot of integrating those trauma. It's a really profound way of working with trauma memories, is what I have found. So, because we're regulated and helping them regulate it. It really aligns with a lot of what they're talking about in the trauma research right now. Okay. Okay, I've got a really long question here. So I'm going to skip. Oh my God, there are a whole bunch of questions coming in here. So, okay, some of these questions are going to take me too long to, well, I guess I'm going to move through some of these short ones and I'll come back to the long one. So the videos for the demo are actually in my Therapy That Works course is where you will find that. If you have my textbook, there's a new ebook that will be coming out with at least for mastering competencies, and hopefully in a couple of years for the counseling books that will have some demonstration videos as well. So the ebook and Mastering Competencies has the video of me doing some interviews, and the interview with my son is actually in the Therapy That Works course, and for right now it's where I'm going to keep it because it's an embarrassing video, but it demonstrates this so beautifully and I can't recreate it. Absolutely, Angie. Collaborative therapy works well with couples and families, in which case you're often trying to get one person's experience and jump in from their holodeck, and you have to sometimes jump into the other holodeck. But as you have more of these conversations, thank God, their holodecks look a little more similar and we're able to kind of move back and forth. But it's definitely a very effective way of working with couples. Does this work? Okay, so I'm getting a question here. Does this work better without knowing anything about the client prior to session and intake paperwork? So yeah, and how does this, do you share this at the beginning with clients? You can, I think it always helps to know a little bit of something about the client. It works either way, works just as well. I mean, I do my initial phone calls with clients. I get a sense of what the problem is. Normally talk with them for 5 to 15 minutes. And that's fine because you're constantly thickening the description, is what qualitative researchers will call it, but you're constantly doing this process of tracking the meaning. So it's fine. What you know beforehand is perfectly fine. I certainly tell my clients about this at the beginning, and the way I actually describe it is something along this little snippet from what I call the therapist song and dance. I normally will say something along the lines of, my kind of default setting, or primary approach that I use is collaborative therapy. It's a newer approach to working with clients where I try to find ways of working in here that really fit for you and are comfortable for you, and also come up with ideas that might fit, that really will work for you outside of session. And so I tell them also, so if you're just sitting there and nodding your head very politely saying, yeah, it's a great idea, therapist, for someone else, but I'd never do it, I say, please let me know. I'm not like a doctor who has 5 medications to treat your condition. It's really infinite, the number of ways I can be helpful to you. So please let me know if something, or an idea I say, or something, the way we're talking here isn't comfortable. Let me know, because I want to have a conversation. There are lots of ways for me to be helpful to you. So that's how I talk about it at the beginning of session. I think a lot of clients really appreciate that invitation to speak up and to have a differing opinion. And for the record, I don't feel like I have a good, quote unquote, rapport relationship until they start disagreeing with me. And when my clients can regularly say, oh, no, it wasn't quite that, it was this, then I know I'm hearing the inner dialogue that I need to be hearing to do my work well. So I do want them to actually correct me and tell me, no, that's not what I meant. and that's, if they do that regularly, then I know we're good. I'm getting enough of that inner dialogue to be helpful. Okay. Let's see. So, someone's asking, is there any further training on appropriately unusual comments? I mean, I think anywhere you can get training in collaborative therapy, you get that through the Houston Galveston Institute. I do it through my Therapy That Works Institute. But this is something that, experiencing it and getting there's an acculturation that happens to learn how to, I think, live and work in this way. So I think just any collaborative training would be the place. I don't know of a single workshop that would have that per se. So Jenny's working, where might a client or find themselves feeling stuck or frustrated? I would say, it's weird and collaborative. When you work this way, the only time you feel stuck or frustrated is when it breaks down into a monologue. I mean, that's the bad part. That's when it breaks down, because otherwise you're always just tracking the meaning making. And if this process is working, there should be, the client is experiencing some new perspectives. I'm trying to think of a client where I don't feel stuck often, so trying to think. And usually when you feel stuck, you would ask yourself, what am I missing? What am I not seeing? What am I not getting? So you would ask, what am I missing that's making this process feel like it's not moving forward? So let's see. A webinar on law and ethics, someone is asking me about. At the moment, I have about 20 different theoretical ones to get through. I will be doing some new law and ethics videos in my therapy there, my licensing course. My Laughter Way to Licensure course will definitely have some updates available soon. And yes, this video will definitely be available on YouTube. So I'm going to go and continue answering some of these questions that are still here. So this first one says, is it compatible with collaborative therapy to say a client who is going through a grief process? I personally assume that it's difficult to go through a grief process, but I'm curious about your feelings on this. Can you tell us a little bit about it? So I just wouldn't say that I assume it's difficult, because that's the part you wouldn't say. You would just ask what happened this week, what's going on, how have you been doing, what are the emotions, how have you been feeling about it all. Normally, as they tell the story, you get a good sense of what they're thinking and feeling about it. But you would say, I'm curious about your how you've been feeling, what your thoughts have been like. And you normally don't tell them you're using a not knowing method. You don't need to say that. You're just being curious, and you act more normal than the average clinician who often talks in very weird ways. Sometimes I was training a group of students at a postmodern class, and I remember we were doing some role plays, and I was kind of like, they were doing some just really deep reflecting of the emotions and the this and the that. And I'm like, you need to go back and ask some normal questions. And the team came back and they're like, yeah, that felt a lot more natural. Like, yes, this should feel very natural. It shouldn't put your clients at ease, but I don't think you need to tell them that this is a not knowing approach. I don't think there would be any need for that per se. Okay, let's see. Sandy, you'd like to hear some hypothetical examples of what a client might say and how to redirect it with curiosity? So if we just go back to someone had just lost their mother, and let's say they're, they say that the week has been really hard, so you're going to be curious what, there's a lot that's been hard, I'm sure, in this week. And what have really been the hardest things for you? Why were those, you think, the hardest parts for you? So you're just going to keep understanding how this all fits together. And whatever they say, you just want to make sure it makes sense to you, how all those pieces would fit together in their universe, about how they're thinking, feeling, seeing, everything that they're talking about. Typically, that's a problem that's going on in their world. Okay, so here's this long one. Okay, so I'm going to read this. If I'm not wrong, while talking about the child whose parents were divorced, you mentioned that initially they did not perceive it negatively, and that their opinions changed. I did say this. So she said, they go on to say, I'm wondering if this non-assuming approach is great because it's not directing the client's opinions or giving them clues as what they should be saying. So yeah, and it's, and that's where you're trying not to give too many opinions and clues about how they should or should not be feeling. this is a great question. I wonder if it's only for the beginning, or should we have this throughout the process? Absolutely, every single session. In some ways, you're always starting with a new client and a new conversation. And yes, you have some of this older information over here, but it's almost like the last session shifts over to, old knowledge, professional knowledge, your personal opinion, and each new conversation, you're meeting them again with a totally fresh new mindset. Which may seem kind of strange. It doesn't mean I don't refer to the old sessions to have a sense of what's going on. But there is this curiosity is so radical that you don't assume from one week to another. I find this particularly apt with couples and families where, like, whoo, you have no idea what kind of arguments and weird, bizarre twists have happened between sessions. So I sit down with my couples now. I'm always like, so how were the last, normally I see them, last 2 weeks, what happened between the last, where are we? Because boy, radical things can happen between sessions. Usually individuals, it's normally not quite as dramatic, but you never know. And there's so many times I'm like, God, I'm glad I started not assuming we're picking up where we left off. And so certainly, yeah, this is a great question too. How does this non-directive approach work across cultures? And I think, yeah, so you're not the expert, and we know that many cultural groups, when surveyed, say they want experts, but they also want people who understand them, right? And understand their worldview. And so even across cultures, this approach is used literally around the globe. When Harleen and I recorded our collaborative dialogic symposium, boy, we had fun or aligning all the time zones. This approach works as practitioners in virtually every, certainly every continent around the globe. It works extremely well cross-culturally because you're entering the client's world, a meaning-making system. And just because you're using a lot of curiosity and not knowing, it doesn't mean you're an idiot and you have no expert knowledge whatsoever. And you introduce it in ways that are culturally appropriate for the client, but not in a way that's culturally oppressive to the client. And so you're still going to use expert knowledge. You're going to understand what they're looking for, what makes sense for within their worldview, and do it in ways that are culturally appropriate. And sometimes they may out and out ask you for your opinion, and you're not going to say, oh, I'm a therapist, I don't, give my opinion or whatever. You will respond in a way that works with their worldview and what they're looking for, and very sensitive to not introducing professional knowledge in a way that shuts down any of their cultural or even personal forms of knowledge and knowing. Okay. This question continues, and there are lots of good pieces here. As the process progresses, will we get used to the experience and thoughts of the clients? And I'm curious about this because we will more likely make assumptions. I think that assumptions made in place and in the right amount can be useful, except for those made at the beginning of the process. I think it is not possible to stop making assumptions, but it's only possible to reflect on our assumptions. And I would think that's, I think I like to think of it as bias. And yes, to a certain degree, we are all imposing biases and assumptions. And in this approach, it is kind of demanding that the clinician engage in a lifelong process of questioning your assumptions, being willing to let the client question your assumptions. And so there is this constantly reflecting on them and realizing that what our assumptions might be may or may not really fit or be useful in the client's world, and having the humility and the grace to recognize, attend to that, and be respectful of that. So I think there is this just this ethos, this is the relational position, right? And I have some very strong opinions as a mental health provider. I do, especially around like, parenting, sleep for children, the effect of, physical health and mental health, right? And I have a lot of science to back me up on a lot of these things. all of that is true. And I have mountains of professional knowledge that I regularly share with my clients, but it is never forced upon them as the ultimate truth that they need to bow down to. It is offered always as a perspective that may be useful to them. And I think that's the difference when we talk about assumptions, is that we really are sensitive about introducing these ideas, whether it comes from professional knowledge, whether it comes from our personal experience, theories, research, that is always introduced, not as the ultimate authority in the conversation. So I hope that is helpful. And I got a question here about whether or not there will also, yes, there will most definitely be a re-recording of the emotionally focused therapy video for sure. So, okay, wonderful. So I see some more questions over here. So hopefully, let's see, it looks like I've answered most of the questions that came up, and I have mostly just thank yous in the comments here. Oh, I guess we had the question about just what would it look like working with couples and families? You know what, you're just going to be making space for each person's perspective and kind of going back and forth, you know, and if they have radically different, sometimes even versions of what happened, you know, party last week, you make space for each of those. And you're not necessarily trying to find the true facts of what actually happened. You're not like the judge and jury of what happened. You're honoring, this is how you remembered it. This is how it felt for you. This is how you recalled it happening. This is how it felt for you. You know, and the same thing with parents and with kids. And we're just, you know, trying to allow actually the members of the family, let's say, or the couple, to become curious about how their partners are hearing each other as well. And so we're even that mutual curiosity, when you've got multiple people in the room, you want them to have that with each other and not just between the clinician and the client. And so awesome. Okay. No. Thank you. Is it Isigu? Yes, your question was long, but we got through it, and I hope thank you. I'm glad you're able to stay and hear it at the end. I know I ran over my projected time. I spent longer talking about this than I anticipated. No, it was an absolute pleasure. And those were great questions. Really appreciate everyone's questions here. Okay, so hopefully I will be doing one of these live trainings once a month, at least for the next couple of years. Is kind of when I look at everything I need to re-record and update. And I've got my to-do list from several of you. And so hopefully you'll be able to join me. And if not, you can always find the newly recorded, updated versions of all of these. And I'll keep the old ones up there too, because I'm sure 10 years ago, I had a different way of teaching all of this. So hopefully that will all come your way as well, or be available as well as you're learning all of these theories. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining me. Those of you watching the recording, this was the first one. So thank you all for being here. This has been incredible. It's been nice to see so many people from around the world. I forgot to have you all introduce where you're from. And so, yeah, hope to see you next month. You be well and take care.